the East. And I know that's disputed, but I'm right about it. And you can check my notes in the book and see the argument.
Yeah, I've gone through it as well. Yeah, no, continue. You're absolutely right, though. Yeah.
So, and then in the Bill Clinton years, you had the shock therapy economic policy. You had the Balkan Wars in Bosnia and in Kosovo, and then you had the NATO expansion. And really was, I think 3 weeks after the ink was dry on the new NATO expansion treaty, they launched the war against Serbia, which was over Russia's dead body, basically. Boris Yeltsin and his entire government had a fit over it, but there was essentially nothing they could do about it. Then W. Bush comes to town, and Putin is new too. Putin's been in power for a year. Bush is also brand new. And so they sort of try to do a reset. Putin calls Bush. He's the first foreign leader to call Bush on September 11th. But just a couple of months later, Bush tears up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the ABM treaty, and in effect also tore up the START II treaty, which hadn't been ratified yet, but was in process. And that START II treaty, his father's treaty, would have banned multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, which matters a lot. But anyway, Bush also did the color-coded revolutions and including overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2004. And in 2008, over the best advice of all of, not just the foreign policy establishment, but his own government, the National Security Council, the CIA, the ambassador and all of his staff at the embassy in Moscow, and even the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, Rice and Gates, all told Bush not to do it. Or at least, I don't know what Rice and Gates told him, but they certainly agreed that it was a bad idea to do it. And we all know, we should know, everyone should find at WikiLeaks the Niet means Niet memo by our current CIA director, William Burns, who was then W. Bush's ambassador to Russia, warning Rice why not to offer NATO membership to Ukraine. And by the way, this whole time, even the expansionist hawks, never mind, libertarian non-interventionists like me or Ron Paul or something like that, but even people like Brzezinski and Kissinger, who were out front in pushing for a NATO expansion, had always said all along, well, of course, we'll have to make a special case for Ukraine. We'll have to ensconce permanent neutrality for Ukraine. We'll have to come up with the Vienna, Austria option, or, the Finland option for neutrality for Ukraine, just like we had in the last Cold War, to prevent, not like we had for Ukraine, but like we had for Austria and Finland in the last Cold War, in order to prevent a fight over it, because the country is so crucial to Russia. And even though so many of the people, especially in the west of the country, really want out from under Russia's domination and would rather move west. So instead of having a fight to the death over it, we should compromise up front. But then they never did that. They never followed through. Then Bush also did the anti-ballistic missile systems in Romania and Poland. Now, this sounds fine. Like, I don't care if my government has anti-ballistic missiles all day, right? What's the problem? Except that there was a reason that Nixon tried to get this treaty done in the first place, and did get it done in the first place, was because it's just arms racing. The more anti-ballistic missiles you make, the more missiles I make, and vice versa the other way. At that time, we already had tens of thousands of H-bombs and ICBMs on each side. There's no point in continuing to escalate. And as we can see, when Bush installed the anti-ballistic missile systems, the Russians just increased their number of offensive missiles. Rather than try to reciprocate with their own super expensive and unworkable design, they just made more offensive missiles. But there's another problem, which is they're launched from dual-use launchers, the Mk-41 or the Mark 41 missile launcher, which can also host Tomahawk cruise missiles, which can be tipped with hydrogen bombs. And this is, of course, in violation of Bill Clinton's promises in the Founding Act of 1997, where he said, yes, we're going to expand NATO further east, but we promise not to move our military equipment in there. But then he did anyway. Oh, I said substantial, and I don't count this as substantial, he said. But this is a real problem, because it was, in essence, tearing up the INF Treaty, or at least violating the spirit of it and putting it in jeopardy. And this was Ronald Reagan's great treaty from 1987 that kept all short and medium-range missiles out of Europe. We still have nuclear bombs there, but only airplane-delivered bombs. We have no nuclear missiles in Europe, and that could change now because the INF Treaty's dead. And it was actually Donald Trump who finally tore it up his last year in office. Then Barack Obama comes in, and there's a lot to it. Of course, the war in Libya is a huge one, another aggressive war by NATO going around the UN Security Council again to do that. But the worst thing of it all was the Maidan Revolution, the so-called Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And people say, oh, you're denying the agency of the people on the ground. Well, look, I mean, the reality is Ukraine is a small, poor country, and America is the global superpower. So when the empire drops a few tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into your protest movement, that makes all the difference. Just imagine for one moment the Occupy movement of a decade ago, or January 6th, only now you have Chinese or Russian agents out there with, supplying, not just, everybody focuses on the sandwiches and cookies. It's not that Nuland was there passing out cookies. It's that, what was she doing there at all? She was there blatantly supporting the revolution and telling the people America's on your side. She had Senators Chris Murphy and John McCain with her. And they spent tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars on the NGOs that supported the entire carnival to keep the thing going for 3 solid months until they could get their deal to force the president to agree to new elections, which led to the street putsch, which was accomplished by local Nazi forces on the ground. And this is another one that's important. And I beat this dead horse beyond any reason in the book, because I know the burden of proof is on me. I know everyone says that this is all just Russian propaganda, but I think we all, if you went to a government school, even in my era, then you probably have heard of the fact that when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, some people in the border countries welcomed them.
Yes. Yeah.
Because they'd been enslaved under Soviet communism. As the worst thing that had ever happened to them. And when the Nazis came, some people sided with them. And that includes in Ukraine. But the people who sided with the Nazis in Ukraine, they were really bad guys. It wasn't just, people from out west. They were already Nazis. There were already, organized groups of Nazis that came and swore their loyalty to Hitler and served him in the war. Then those same forces were supported by the CIA during the Cold War through the end of the 1950s as part of a stay-behind type operation. People are probably familiar with Gladio. That's in Western Europe, but this is the same kind of thing, supporting stay-behind forces during the Cold War. And then after that, the fighting fell apart and ended in the 50s. America, the CIA, and whatever still supported all the Ukrainian exile groups in the United States and Canada, many of which were founded by Nazi exiles and expats who had escaped after World War II. And then even beginning in the 80s with Glasnost and Perestroika, but especially in the 90s, and then after 2004, these groups poured a ton of money in to reestablish all these Nazi militias and to rewrite the whole history of Ukraine, to try to make George Washington and Nathaniel Greene out of these guys, because they had no real heroes to be the founders of their state. So their heroes are a bunch of Hitler-serving Nazis, Holocaust-perpetrating Nazis.
We learned a little bit of that
these are the groups that did the putsch, that overthrew the government in 2014, and then were put to use fighting the people of the East when they refused to accept the new coup junta. In the war in the Donbass when it broke out. So I'll skip Trump and Russiagate for a minute, but I'll just say this about Trump. His own government told the New York Times, you can read it, Keith Gesson in the New York Times, The Quiet Americans is the article. And they say Donald Trump is like the captain of a ship. He's holding the wheel, but it's not attached to anything. And so his government had their own Russia policy, as we saw with the impeachment and all of that. But then I'm rambling on, so I'll wrap this up here.
Sure.
In the year 2021, Joe Biden's first year in office, he came in, and this is just his basic psychology. It's also the way the entire empire thinks, too. Everything is a simple historical analogy, because none of them ever really read anything or know anything. So they always go for these simple historical claims. And Joe Biden's framework for understanding the entire situation was Putin is Hitler and he's Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
And what you do with bullies is you punch them in the nose and you force them to back down, and you always stand up to them and this and that and the other thing. But, over at Harvard, Stephen Walt said, actually, you're applying the wrong model. This is like, these guys that went to Georgetown or whatever, they have, the textbook formulas already for this stuff. And he says, look, you're going on the Hitler appeasement model, but you shouldn't be. You should be going on the other page is the spiral model.
Yes.
Where the other side actually has real concerns, and you could, yes, appease them, to use a bad word, to prevent a worse crisis from breaking out. And it wouldn't be the wrong thing to do, particularly when a country like Ukraine is so much more important to Russia than it is to the United States.
Yeah,
and so, but they refused to look at it that way. They looked at it. In fact, you see Biden did nothing but escalate more arms. He had the State Department and Defense Department promise further integration into NATO and interoperability with our military. They refused to negotiate with good faith when Putin introduced the treaty.
Yeah.
They talk about the treaty now like it's completely insane. Oh, he says that we should move all our military forces back to the